Kia ora koutou, ko Alice Mills te poingoa. Hei pekenga matua aho ki waipapa tō matarau. Hello everybody, my name's Alice. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. This is my colleague Anika, who's the master's student on our study that we're going to talk to you today, which aims to explore the role of stable housing in reducing reoffending amongst people who have left prison in Aotearoa in New Zealand. Today, we're going to draw upon the first part of the study, which has involved structured interviews with over 200 prisoners prior to release, and then follow-up interviews approximately 6 months and 12 months after release. We'll give you some context for the study, describe the sample and representativeness, particularly the follow-up sample, given the level of attrition that we've experienced. And we'll also just give you some kind of preliminary results as to the relationships between stable housing and recidivism. This is very much a work in progress, but it will just give you some idea of those relationships. And also it will give you some idea of how we need to tease out a little bit more what is actually meant by stable housing and how we account for attrition in the survey as well. So firstly, just a little bit of context in relation to release and recidivism in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So in 2019, nearly 7,600 sentenced prisoners were released from New Zealand prisons. We chose in 2019 because that's the year where we actually did most of the interviews. And of those released around about that time, within 2 years, around about 60% were resentenced and just over 41% were re-imprisoned. As you can see there, the figures for Māori are quite a bit higher than that, and particularly if you compare that with the rates for both European and Pacific groups. So for re-sentence, that was around about 55% for European and Pacific groups, and around for re-imprisonment, it was around about 35%. Okay. And in terms of the kind of situation when people are released from prison, well, corrections research has actually indicated that only around about half of people that are released are able to settle into long-term accommodation. And we know that people leaving prison are likely to face a number of really considerable and substantial barriers to finding housing, including the lack of suitable, affordable housing, the stigma of a prison record, but also some restrictions on where they are, where they're allowed to live, where they're able to live. And housing provision funded by corrections and partners has increased and diversified in recent years, and they provide accommodation through various different initiatives, including things such as very short-term emergency accommodation, transitional accommodation 3 to 6 months, but also specialist provision for specific groups such as Māori and women. Much of this accommodation is for those who are deemed to be high risk or with high and complex needs. But in the budget 2018, Corrections and Housing New Zealand were awarded just under $58 million for various different housing initiatives under the Housing Support Services Programme. And this basically aims to increase the number of places available to increase the services available for 300 people annually. And that programme contains initiatives for wahine Māori, those who are deemed to be very high risk and subject to extended supervision orders, and also includes some more transitional accommodation as well. In terms of the importance of stable post-release housing, well, various international studies over the last 20 or so years have really highlighted the importance of housing as part of the reintegration process. So in the US, for example, Bradley et al. Have described housing as the linchpin of the reintegration process. Ogilvy in Australia sees it as central to reintegration. And research from by Corrections New Zealand also discovered that more than any other factor, lack of stable accommodation was the most critical contributor to negative post-release outcomes. Also, various international studies have suggested that stable housing, and being so pivotal to reintegration, is also associated with a reduced risk of reoffending after release from prison. And conversely, post-prison homelessness is likely to increase the risk of reoffending. So estimates of the reduced risk range from around about 11% from Ellison et al. To 62% from Baldry et al. But it's important to note that these existing studies have a range of different methodological limitations. In some cases, they're based on only parolee samples, or they only examine re-imprisonment rather than broader measures of recidivism, or they only evaluate specialist housing projects. In addition to that, the definition of stable housing also really varies, with some people using words like permanent or settled, but rarely actually explaining what they mean by this. or in some cases others are simply compare those who have accommodation with those that don't, and other studies count the number of times that somebody has moved to try and capture housing instability. In addition to that, little is known from the current literature about the sort of how and why stable housing may reduce recidivism. What are the mechanisms in that relationship? Is it perhaps because housing is linked with stable employment? Is it also perhaps because stable housing may be linked to various minor factors? And again, we know from international literature that those with strong family support are less likely to reoffend. So we need to try and understand some of these confounding factors as well, and whether they may be just that stable housing, along with those factors, are just part of a broader pattern of stability post-release. So in order to do that, basically our study, as Barry said, funded by the Royal Society of New Zealand Marsden Fund, basically has two key aims. Partly, we're also very aware of the kind of that international research is not always transferable to New Zealand. Our first aim is to examine whether stable housing is associated with reduced recidivism in a potentially causative relationship. So we're doing this by following a cohort of participants through the period from release from prison and then sort of beyond, basically to establish whether there is any kind of relationship, but also trying to account for some of those confounding factors as well. And then in the second part of the study, which is a qualitative part of the study, which we're not going to discuss today, we've also been trying to examine the how and why of any relationship between housing and reduced reoffending. In particular, looking at the political, social and cultural context in which housing is provided, the relationship between stable housing and forms of social capital, and the meaning of stable housing and the degree to which this actually also may intersect with ideas of home. And to do just in relation to that first part that we're going to talk about today, so this is kind of stage one of our study. We've conducted pre-release interviews with just over 200 participants in 6 prisons, and we conducted these up to 4 weeks before somebody was due to be released. Then we started post-release interviews roughly at the 6 months and 12 months part, although there were some events that stopped that from being exactly around about those times. And we've based this on Baldry et al. Study, which is a study from Australia, who also followed a cohort of participants through, conducted pre-release interviews and then post-release interviews actually at 3 different time points. In terms of this timeline, just gives you some indication of how the research went. So we started off our interviews in the first prison in March 2019. And then our interviewees were gradually released from the various prisons between mid-March and early December. Post-release interviews then started between mid-October, you can see there, and then the first post-release interview didn't actually finish until June 2020. And this is partly because of being affected by the COVID lockdowns, although we did some of the interviews via phone, and we did do some of them face-to-face, and it also stopped us from being able to, quite understandably stopped us from being able to go into prisons to follow people up who've since been reincarcerated. The second post-release interviews then started at the end of May. Second wave, like, of the post-release interviews started at the end of May and carried on actually until February this year, although I should point out that the February this year interview is an outlier. It was actually somebody who's involved in our sample. We'd been chasing them up, leaving messages, and several months later they actually got back in touch, and we decided that it was still worth keeping them in the study. So in the first wave of post-release interviews, we managed to recruit 80 participants. As I say, this was partly affected by COVID lockdowns. This was 40% of the original sample, and 14 of the people that we spoke to at this point were in prison at this time point. For the second wave of interviews, we managed to complete 66 because it was becoming quite a bit harder to find people at this point, although we did manage to include some participants we had missed in the first wave. So this was just 33% of the original sample, and 13 of those people were interviewed whilst in prison. In total, we actually managed to include around about 51% of the pre-release sample in either the first or second wave of the post-release interviews. Most studies tend to kind of manage somewhere between 20 and 50%. Largely seems to depend quite a lot on how many people you have to be able to chase people up. And we hadn't really expected quite as high an attrition rate as we ended up with. As I say, this is partly due to COVID. Baldry et al. Managed to achieve around about 70% although they're a little bit cagey about that. They suggest that they either managed to interview 70% or gather information about them. So it's not really clear quite what that means. That we were able to achieve this amount at all is largely thanks to the hard work of our research assistants, Cinnamon Lindsay Latimer, who some of you may have met if you've been to this colloquium in years past, who generally did the very hard work of tracking people down. And we were also helped enormously by Anna Duncan and Paula Pope from Corrections, who gave us up-to-date contact details where they had them for people that we couldn't find. And this really helped to bolster our sample. We did also try and trace people through various community agencies, and we had people's consent to do this, but we actually weren't able to find anybody in this way. I'm now just going to pass over to Anika, who is going to discuss more information about the representativeness of post-release samples and give some indications from our preliminary analysis.
Kia ora, and thank you, Alice, for that introduction. I'm Anika, and I'm just going to walk you through a bit more of what we're actually seeing in the data that we do have, especially as you might have noticed earlier in our numbers, we lost a lot of our sample. It was unfortunate, but it was always going to be difficult with the highly transient population that we're following. As we did lose many people by the first interview, and losing more than 20% would be cause for concern. The study would be quite susceptible to bias from things that we don't know about the people that have left. It's unfortunate, but we try to control for the losses in the areas that we do know about. As we'll go through soon, we can see that there's no clear reason other than age in the post-release interviews that we can see that they may have dropped out of the study. Other than that, the rest of the variables of interest were in relatively similar proportions throughout most of the key variables. So first off, we're going to look at the ethnicity and how it was captured across interviews. We can see that the numbers aren't going to add to 100%, and that's because we let people stay if they were more than one ethnicity. The ethnic makeup of the interviewees in each stage remain relatively constant with at most a 4% change. So we're not seeing any one ethnicity drop out of the study at a higher rate than the others. Moving on to the gender of the participants. Overall, the proportions of each gender interviewed at each time point were very similar. We did lose a few more females in the time two. However, this really wasn't large compared to the huge drop-off that we did experience. Looking at the age demographic, this is where we start to see the only trend that we really noticed in people dropping out of the study. So we noticed that people who are older were more likely to be retained in future interviews, whereas those that were younger were getting lost. And it was of concern because the trend was for older people to either have had stable housing before prison or have plans for stable housing after prison. Here we can have a look at those actual numbers. So from these tables, you can see that the relationship between age groups and stable housing for the pre-release interview data. The older they get, you can see the more likely they are to be in stable housing, either before prison or in their plans directly after prison. We also looked at the location that the participants served their sentence. The most difficult to capture was the participants from the Northland area. However, it's quite good for the large amount of variables that we had in this one variable. So we had a lot of options for the different prisons, and given that, it's actually not too large a percentage lost comparatively. We did ask the participants in their pre-release interview how long their sentence had been. We grouped these into three groups. It was either less than a year, 1 to 2 years, or over 2 years. The graph shows the proportions in which these groups were retained in the two ways of interviews, and the proportions, either very short or longer, were retained in very similar proportions throughout. So we're keeping those people who had either the shorter or more serious sentences. So there was nothing to say whether they'd keep in the sample by the seriousness or length of their serving. Other demographics of interest that we retained in similar proportions were whether participants had children, their highest qualification or level of study, whether they were employed before prison or planning on employment after prison, and criminal history. So we did keep people with similar amounts of criminal convictions or imprisonments in the study in very, very similar amounts. Although there's room for bias that could have been introduced due to the losses, having samples that have overall similar characteristics was at least quite encouraging, apart from the age factor that you've seen. So this is moving on to looking at how we actually listed people as being stable or unstable. So research participants were asked about the type of housing they were living in and the number of times that they moved in the 6 months before prison or before their next releases. If they were interviewed post-release outside of prison, we just asked them about where they had been living or how many moves they had in the 6 months prior. If they had been in prison when they were followed up for an interview, then it was asked about the time before their most recent prison conviction, how many times they had moved in that time period or the past 6 months beforehand, or the type of housing that they'd been in. And at the first and second wave of post-release interviews, there were 14 and 13 people who were interviewed in prison respectively. The first measure of housing stability is quite straightforward. It's just the number of moves, with 2 or more moves being listed as unstable housing. And this is the same measure used by Bulge et al. In their 2003 paper, who decided to use the measure rather than homelessness because they found participants who had a bed in a shelter, for example, for a few nights, did not consider themselves homeless, even though they might not have had permanent accommodation. There was one caveat to this conceptualization of stable housing. Some people who stated they were living in a car or a tent or living rough, they said that they might have moved 0 to 1 times within the 6 months prior, despite their living arrangement. However, it was decided these cases would be counted as 2+ moves to properly capture the highly unstable nature of their living arrangements. And there were 8 such people that actually did answer that before prison. The other measure for stable housing was based upon the type of housing a person had in the interviews. Participants could choose 1 or more of the options listed here, but essentially what we ended up grouping was the least stable type of housing was allocated to them as their type of housing, just to properly convey how stable their real arrangements were over this time period. And where they answered somewhere else, they were placed into one of these categories by us based on other answers. There were so few people in these categories overall in the later time periods, especially, that we did have to group them in some way. And we chose to group them into stable or unstable, where, as you can see by the red line, that's our cutoff for where we chose stable and unstable. So we've got owned, rented, state housing, and housing first or NGO as our stable housing types, and family or friends, hotel and motel, hostel, boarding backpackers, campground, holiday park, or homeless. Family and friends being grouped as unstable might seem as a little bit controversial, which is why this table has been included. The housing type before prison shows that the number of moves that you had if you were with friends or family was over half were going to be moving around quite a lot. And so because of this, we decided that it was actually not that stable, and we decided to group it with the unstable types of housing. However, we do recognise that both of these are rather crude distinctions at the moment, and they'll both need further refinement as we progress in our analysis. For example, we will need to examine if there's any difference in the number of moves according to who exactly participants were living with and the relationship to the cohabitees, for example, separating out more the friends and family based on who they were living with, and whether those subgroups be put into stable or unstable. These plots show the percentages of people who had stable or unstable housing before prison prior to each wave of interviews post-release. So this is the changing over time. Here we can see that participants in the first wave of interviews for the stable housing are less likely to have stable housing than before prison. But we can see that the number of moves before prison is quite similar. So in both of these tables, both of these percentages, you can see that the number of moves and stable housing have changed quite drastically at the second time period towards the more stable types of housing. And we'll actually bring that up in the next slide. So this is where we start to see some bias creeping in the second time. Okay. So this is looking at the re-imprisoned or re-sentenced people in our population. Unfortunately, though, most of the subpopulations were retained in similar proportions in later interviews, those that were either re-sentenced or re-imprisoned, as within 12 months, were showing some bias. So corrections supplied us with information on whether study participants had been re-sentenced or re-imprisoned within 12 months, as well as their outcome type from the re-offence and the start date for the outcome. Thank you to corrections for that. the resentenced and re-imprisoned mentioned from now on will refer to that. So at time 0 and time 1, we can see that we've actually retained quite well the people who have reoffended or been re-imprisoned. However, at time point 2, there is actually a significant relationship between both of those with if they had re-sentenced or re-imprisoned, which means that we're likely could be losing people due to being harder to reach before they did reoffend or unable to be contacted once they had reoffended. Whatever the case, the sample became biased and it wasn't able to adequately capture the population of interest. As there was a relationship between these, who was interviewed and who reoffended, we are focusing on the time point 1 and where people moved in the first 6 months and how that might have affected their reoffence within the first year. Now we're going to look at the relationships that we do have in this first 6 months post-release. From now on, we'll just be focusing on what happened after release into the first wave of interviews, specifically to the people who were found to be interviewed in the first wave of interviews. These were 66 who were found in the community and 14 in prison. This is not adjusted. This is what we've observed. The analysis, so the stable housing in the time before the first wave of post-release interviews showed evidence of a relationship with re-imprisonment, and that was very significant. And those with stable housing in the first wave of post-release interviews were less likely than those with unstable housing to have been re-imprisoned. This was by 4.6 times more likely if you're in unstable housing to have been re-imprisoned than those without. Stable housing in the time before the first wave of post-release interviews did not show a significant relationship with resentencing. However, I think it's important to show these other slides about the other relationships of stable housing with reoffending types, just because you can see throughout them that there's still that same relationship. And in this case, those with unstable housing in the first wave of interviews were 1.5 times more likely than those with stable housing to be resentenced. So although it's not significant, we're still seeing the same direction of effects. And then looking at the number of moves as our measure of stable housing with re-imprisonment, it was not significant again, but those who moved around less were 1.6 times less likely than those with stable housing to have been re-imprisoned. And then we did have a slight significant relationship, very slight, with the number of moves and resentencing. And those who moved around a lot post-release were 1.7 times more likely than those with more stable housing to have been resentenced. So as we can see, although it wasn't significant in all of these tables, we can see the direction happening in the same direction, where we can see that the stable types of housing are actually less likely to have reoffended. Moreover, both the number of moves and stable housing type before prison had very significant chi-squared test values for both resentencing and re-imprisonment, showing that the type of housing before the prison sentence as well does have a relationship. And in each case, both those with unstable housing types were more likely to reoffend. So whilst many studies have shown that there is a correlation between stable housing and reduced recidivism, most have not tried to consider the same amount of confounding factors that might affect this relationship as we tried to capture in this research. What we would really like to be able to do is to use inverse probability weighting on this data, as what this would allow us to do is reweight the observations so that it would be similar to what we'd expect in a randomized trial. This means we can take the 80 observations that we had in the beginning and through to the first wave of interviews, and then instead of trying to adjust the first wave of interviews so that it matches up with the first time point, instead we're focusing on trying to make it as if it was a randomized trial. So we reweight based on the probability of them being in stable or unstable housing, and then try and balance the different characteristics that we're seeing. So for example, we'd want the same ratios of people in each age group applied to each of the different outcomes. And ideally, this would allow for estimates of the treatment's effect on a randomized trial or something similar to. Failing this, to search for the effects of stable housing on reoffence using covariate adjustment would allow for estimates of the effect on stable housing on reoffence. Matching has been used in comparative studies. However, it's not really going to be of use here, as we're trying to match on so many different covariates that it just wouldn't be practical. Or if it would have needed to be designed into the study, and it would take a lot of time and effort to try and make this matching complete. Ideally, we would have been able to find the effects of stable housing after accounting the likely confounders listed here. Unfortunately, as only 80 people could be interviewed at the first wave of post-release interviews, it's unlikely that there's going to be a way to weight the inverse probabilities correctly so that we can find properly weighted data set that we can actually analyze. Although adjusting for a subset of the confounders is less reliable, choosing only confounders which indicated to be present in our specific data set is showing some promise at this stage. And failing this, logistic regression with covariate adjustment of so many variables on a model based on 80 different people is also far from ideal.
So just in conclusion then, as you can see, the initial analysis at this stage does tend to confirm the international research suggesting that stable housing might reduce, may well reduce the risk of recidivism. However, we also appreciate that there are a number of kind of things that we need to work on further before we can say this for absolutely certain. In particular, we're concerned that we need to further consult with Maori in order to understand how they interpret or conceptualise ideas of what might be stable housing and whether this may differ from more Eurocentric views. This is especially important as we found that Maori were more likely to have experienced unstable housing, defined by a number of moves, yet of course this may not actually align with Maori views of unstable housing. We're also aware that we need to unpack that category of family and friends and really just ascertain whether this entire category should be counted as unstable housing or whether or not there may be kind of other relationships at play which basically suggest that some of the people that we're staying with, family and friends, actually have more stable accommodation than others. So we need to consider how we might split this up into subgroups and whether some might go to the stable category and others may go to the unstable category. And from the analysis perspective of this, we are planning on continuing to explore if there's a way that inverse probability weighting can be done for such a small data set while still trying to adjust for as many of the suspected confounding variables as we can, perhaps with a subset of these variables. Also refocusing the effects of stable housing plans after prison sentence, perhaps. So then we'd keep the full sample and look at what they plan to have as stable housing afterwards as well. And after that, possibly creating many models for subsets of the variables suggested to be confounders and then averaging over the effects of stable housing for those different models. Okay, any questions?
Did you look specifically, because like this is coming from, you know, doing a lot of surveys, did you look specifically at the interactions around, and I can see this through the numbers, I can't know,
Yeah.
around ethnicity, gender and age? I'm just saying that in terms of Māori men, especially urban living Māori men, are like near impossible to get to do our surveys generally.
So the question is around, did we look at, I'll include myself in this, did we look at interactions between gender, age and ethnicity?
So in terms of the gender, age and ethnicity, we haven't looked too much at, we've looked at to see if they do interact, but not how it's affected the dropout. Yeah.
We do have some of those in the sample there.
Yeah, but it's just again like that challenge of like who is in the sample versus who the other people that are responding to surveys. So,
In the last couple of years, it's obviously been really hard to survive in New Zealand without a gift box card. And obviously, it does appear that the banking system doesn't always like people who come with trippers or all sorts of difficult circumstances. The other thing is we've become awfully conscious about ID. But to what extent are they, how did you take account of those two components in the difficulty that you're talking about? It must be almost impossible to have a country in New Zealand without a gift box card.
So the question is around, could we or did we take account of the fact that people may leave prison without things that you need to survive in the world, such as an EFTPOS card,
And to be
and to be recognised. Yep.
Yeah, that's not something that we did ask about. And I have to say, we didn't actually find that was a massive problem in our sample. So it wasn't something that people have generally brought up. And I want to just draw upon the qualitative research actually at this point, because that has been, we didn't ask about that in the quantitative interviews. We only really had the chance to ask about that kind of thing in the qualitative, where we've actually asked people to tell us a story of when they were released, what happened then. And for the most part, so far, it hasn't been a problem. The only thing that I would say about that is the other thing that people expect everybody to have at the moment is a cell phone, a cell phone number. And that includes us, because that's how we kept in touch with people. And one of the things that we discovered through doing this research, and Cinnamon in particular could talk to you quite a lot more about this, was the difficulties of that, because often people would give you the cell phone number, they'd actually give corrections to cell phone number and never switched it on. So we got an awful lot straight to voicemails. We now also realise a lot of people don't even listen to their voicemails. Sometimes we were able to get through people through text, but often it turned out that they have several different phone numbers, and and that's part of the reason why we did get that late participant actually, because it was somebody who responded to our voicemail some time after we first tried to contact them. Oh, I'm not sure that I'm.
So sorry, the question is, are there any interventions the study will feed into, perhaps through corrections?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that, really, on the grounds that I'm not actually from corrections. We're aware that corrections are engaging in a number of different house projects at the moment. No, we didn't ask that question. Although we're aware that we have quite a number of gang members in the study. And again, that's coming out a little bit more through the qualitative interviews.
I was going to say, did that come up as part? They must have come up as part of the interviews that you and Cinnamon did, right?
Yeah, it's particularly coming up more as the qualitative interviews. Again, as we ask people to tell them a little bit about themselves, we get a lot more of that kind of backstory and how they're released, and how gang affiliations can sometimes play into that. I mean, to the point of sometimes providing stable housing for them.
I just welcome the opportunity to go on the study with them. That's so interesting. But, I just wondered if there was any consideration around the ethics of naming the specific prisons rather than just being like 31 prisons. They're being pushed back on that?
No,
No,
I have to say, no, not overly. I mean, it won't be. We won't be revealing who is from each prison at any particular point. So because it's all group data.
Also, I think it's unlikely that we're going to say anything really about if there were effects from prisons. So it's like the focus is on looking at stable housing and not what the other confounders might have on it.
but that only comes in.
Yeah. And of course, different prisons can have some slightly different populations as well. But then that then really comes out through the length of sentences more than anything.
I should say that from the prison people that we did retain, there was no relationship that was in our sample